I've got news for you, crewmen. Voyager isn't exactly a safe haven, Captain Janeway pointed out in Good Shepherd. Truer words were never spoken, and with all the death and destruction above, Mortimer Harron did just as well to stay down on Deck 15, let's be honest. He might have been missing out, but at least he wasn't missing any more base pairs on his 13th chromosome or otherwise. For the crew of the Intrepid class, and that after the initial demise of a good deal of the original senior staff, a previously largely unexplored quadrant brought with it previously unknown hazards, as well as a fresh batch of homicidal aliens. At first, if the Kazon were just a pain in the secondary command processors, the Vidians were far more deadly, though the phage was just a phase for Voyager, soon past the boundaries of the local organ harvest. The Borg's backyard, the Hirogens' hunting grounds, and the Malon's mess were then but a handful of the extra obstacles the ship had to pass through en route back to the Alpha Quadrant. And let's not forget the mortal danger posed by numerous anomalies, wacky nebulae, and whatever the Q count as. More than one crew member ended their journey home through one of Voyager's torpedo tubes, and a fair few weren't even granted that final dignity. In this quadrant, our delta means death. I'm Ellie for TrekCulture, and these are the 10 most messed up deaths in Star Trek Voyager. Number 10, don't love what you've done with the face, Lieutenant Durst. Just a quick note for all the Vidians out there, if you do want to impress a Klingon, maybe just bring some blood wine, rather than a skin transplant from the guy you've just murdered, for Pete's sake. Even Michael Myers had the decency to wear a Captain Kirk mask, not William Shatner's actual face. Having only appeared briefly in one episode prior to the Grim Graft, Lieutenant Durst's time on Voyager was both short and stomach-churning. Gruesome fun fact also about faces, the actor who played Durst, Brian Markinson, also played his Vidian butcher, so at least no one had to be killed for their flesh in real life. Joking aside though, that knowledge does add an extra layer of horror to Markinson's portrayal of the Vidian chief surgeon. Having to pretend that your own face is now a mask that one of your characters has torn off to wear from another one of your characters is probably not something they teach you at drama school. Well, maybe they do at RADA, I don't know. We also know from the very first appearance of the species in Phage and then later in Deadlock that the Vidians don't seem to really care if you're dead or even unconscious before they start their organ extraction process. I'll leave you guys to consider the grisly implications of that little thought for Lieutenant Durst. Now we also learn that Durst's other organs wound up in more than a dozen other Vidians, which is a spin-off series just waiting to be made. The Many Bodies of Lieutenant Durst? Okay, the name needs a little work. Number 9, Apples and Oranges, Ensign Jatal. At the end of Latent Image, the Doctor read from Dante's La Vita Nuova, but throughout he'd been faced with his own Cornelian dilemma, forced to make an impossible choice between two options of equal medical weight, in which, and not by his original programming, he chose to save his friend. His ruminations on the decision would become a feedback loop. What was an ethical nightmare for the EMH and quite the drama to deal with for the rest of the crew meant in the most concrete of terms the death of Ensign Jatal. Now we, the viewer, would never even have heard of her or her demise had it not been for a slight anomaly on Harry Kim's holo image some 18 months later. The manner of Jatal's death looked particularly unpleasant. Killed in a senseless attack by an unknown species whose hand weapons were designed to leave behind plasmic energy, which would then travel up the spinal cord and into the brain. Jatal died from massive synaptic failure as the Doctor operated on Harry instead. To be kinder to the EMH also, there were never just two options, but always a third, although one almost unthinkable for a Doctor, not to act at all. In making a choice, however arbitrary, the Doctor didn't kill anyone, but in fact saved a life and opened a new chapter on his own. Silver linings and all that? Well, I guess not for Jatal. Number 8, Bones for Dinosaurs, Ensign Hogan. We've been digging them up for long enough now, even longer by the 24th century, so I suppose it was only fair that the dinosaurs got to have a go at unearthing us. When Voth scientists and relatives of the Hadrosaur, Professor Gagan and Assistant Veer, found Ensign Hogan on Hanon 4, he was but a pile of bones and a bit of uniform for them to study for a distant origin. Gagan and Veer didn't even complete the set of their morbid Voyager collectible, leaving Hogan's skeleton altogether a little lopsided. Presumably, either all or just the rest had been through the digestive tract of the horrifying Hannonian land eel, which was named as such in the Star Trek Encyclopedia, which had attacked and killed Hogan in Basics Part 2. Good job it wasn't a moopsie, or Gagan and Veer would have had nothing to work with. Waste nothing. That's one of the first rules of survival. Yes, Neelix, but the absolute very first rule of survival is, well, survival. So perhaps you shouldn't have told Hogan to linger around the entrance of an unexplored alien cave to pick up every last one of someone else's bones? Resources are no use to the dead. Screams of terror were the last we heard from Hogan. Later, another crew member was gobbled up by the eel. This time so completely, though, that they couldn't even go the way of the dinosaurs. Number 7, pressures of peer review, an unnamed crew member. Publish or perish, they say in academia, where the rigours of having to write regular research papers can be quite overwhelming. In this case, those who had snuck aboard Voyager in scientific method to observe and conduct all sorts of experiments on the crew proved that if you don't care about the ethics committee, publish and perish are not necessarily mutually exclusive terms. Death might have been preferable to all the genetic tag-induced maladies and invisible prodding and poking. Captain Janeway certainly didn't get a wink of sleep in between the needles in her skull and those vigorous massages. Chakotay and Neelix did get to have their anything you can do, I can do sicker moment of one-upmanship, however, so it wasn't all bad news. With Voyager one big petri dish, as the Doctor put it, it's a wonder there weren't multiple fatalities, but there was in fact just one, and it was particularly horrific. By whatever method of the incognito aliens, one crew member on the bridge ended up with a blood pressure reading 360/125, so abnormally high that you could see the vessels on her face almost trying to escape her body. As her arteries burst under the strain, bleeding internally and in cardiac arrest, her entire circulatory system quickly collapsed, with the inevitable brain death that then followed. In that moment, Janeway decides to put an end to the so-called science of those who would claim to be her peers by running a little experiment of her own. Number 6, time warp again, the entire crew minus multiple 7 of 9s. If you thought the Krenim chronophage was bad enough, try a Force 3 temporal disruptor. Braxton, you time-hopping menace. Though he blamed Captain Janeway for everything, the current and former captain of the USS Relativity was the cause of more paradoxes than Agent Daniels could shake an infinity key at. Braxton's thirst for revenge led to the destruction of Voyager with all hands. As with anything involving time travel, death is something you can do again. Though we only saw Voyager explode once, in our time frame, of course, we can assume that those events happened a couple of times. 7 of 9 had been recruited twice before by future murderer Captain Braxton, in his time frame, naturally. Unlike the Pogo paradox, however, intervention to prevent an event can actually prevent the event, so none of it ever occurred in the first place. You with me? Janeway's come here often to Braxton may have been a bit on the nose, but it did have the virtue of being on time. Before that, and in at least one version of the timeline, therefore, the crew of Voyager did have to suffer being ripped apart at the molecular level, essentially by temporal tidal forces that existed between the various space-time fractures of ever-increasing magnitude created by Braxton's little disruptor. Still, it did all make for one hell of a ping-pong match. Number 5, just a bunch of oily secretions, victims of Dejarin. I mean, technically speaking, the HD25 isomorphic projection, aka Dejarin, wasn't wrong. Us organics really are condemned to live our lives inside a biological cage of flesh and bone and blood, shedding and secreting all manner of cells and substances. There is a difference, however, between being ashamed to be made in our image and going about murdering said image. As the counselor said to the hologram, you're projecting. It was a bold move to begin an episode on the sight of a dead body slumped up against a wall. A body which was then dragged feet first down a corridor of an unknown ship by an extremely pale individual, as though he was just taking out the recycling. Ever the bunch of inconsiderates, the dead did leave a trail of mess behind too, but if you are going to commit to murder, you can't really complain about the cleanup. However you look at it, revulsion was truly revolting. Of course, the most messed up part of the episode was when Tuvok pulled out a phaser set on kill and fired it at Paris and Kim as payback for their little live long and prosper practical joke. I'm only kidding. What the Vulcan does on his holodeck in his own time is his own business. The really terrible moment came when B'Elanna discovered not one, but two victims of Djarin while trying to access his matrix. And Torres nearly became victim number 3 when the HD-25 with the murderous malfunction plunged his arm into her chest. You know, maybe it's time they upgraded to 4K. Oh yeah, moving on. Number 4, that damned Nebula, another unnamed crew member. Ooh, a Nebula! Nothing bad's ever happened in Star Trek in one of those, right? Especially not one named Mutara. We'll be fine! Let's go straight in. How bad can it be? Well, as one crew member was about to find out, deadly subnucleonic radiation kinda bad. In one, Ensign No Name at the back of the bridge couldn't just take an analgesic and whack a dermal regenerator across it. He's dead, 7 of 9 gave as her expert and completely necessary diagnosis, after she'd rolled the guy over like he was a comatose targ who'd been at the blood wine. Dead he definitely was, and in the most dreadful fashion, as if all the radiation from the nebula had decided to focus in his direction. As for the poor guy's face, well, let's just say it made Neelix's inflamed sunburn in Sankatse look positively pleasant by comparison. For the rest of the crew, it was night-night in stasis pods, with or without the teddy bear. Notice that Tom Paris went walkabouts a total of 4 times during the trip through the nebula and didn't suffer anything close to the same fate as the bloke on the bridge? Yeah, maybe a little bit of plot safety there. Before Voyager, the crew of the NX-01 had undergone a similar experience. Dr. Phlox nearly shot Porthos, but everyone else was fine. Number 3, one nacelle to go, Lieutenant Joe Carey. I'm sure there's a metaphor somewhere in that ship in a bottle. The nacelle is Joe Carey, and Voyager is now incomplete without him. Carey hadn't had the best of luck in the Delta Quadrant. First of all, he was in the Delta Quadrant. Second of all, he'd only been there all of 5 minutes and he was punched in the face and pipped to the post of chief engineer by the very person who'd just broken his nose in 3 places. Understandably a little annoyed in the moment, Carey was so nice though that he congratulated B'Elanna on her posting at the end of Parallax. In Friendship 1, as he stood between the transport enhancers, Carey could see his ultimate fate staring back at him at the end of a barrel. By the time the transporter beam had cycled, it was already too late. Lying on the sickbay floor, Carey had become the latest and last casualty of a story that had begun centuries before his birth. In launching the probe of the episode title, the Earth of 2067 couldn't have known that an entire civilization would be destroyed as a result. But then they could all have been a little bit more careful, couldn't they? If there is a metaphor to be extended, it's that real life and death isn't contained quite as neatly as to a bottle. Number 2, Destination Dichromates, Silver Blood Voyager. With such a knowing title, the episode Course Oblivion couldn't really have been headed towards an ending any less than tragic. Having the title displayed as usual just after the credits had rolled was more than just a hint in this case, but it certainly didn't detract from the next 38 minutes or so. Done well, dramatic irony plus death is the most kind of messed up. As we learned the true nature of the dichromate duplicates along with them, we also, in theory, knew something that they didn't. That they were all well and truly screwed from the beginning. We all like to think we're unique, when in reality we're just variations on a theme. The dichromate crew were not the originals, but as copies, they were practically indistinguishable from the real thing. There was something beyond the uncanny, therefore, in seeing what was, for all intents and purposes, our beloved cast of characters of 5-ish years slowly degrade and die one by one until the ship itself became a cloud of particles. Moreover, and in spite of their best efforts, none of what had distinguished the Silver Blood crew from the real Voyager after their paths had diverged at the end of Demons would be preserved for history. Surely the most messed up part of the whole episode came when the signal beacon, or the time capsule containing all the ship's logs and records, was destroyed in the launch tube. If, to paraphrase another one of those messed up deaths from the franchise, death is that stage where you exist in the minds of others, then the worst fate is oblivion, in the sense of the state of being forgotten. Number 1, I wanted to be a spaceman, Harry's Kim. All Harry Kim ever dreamt of was being a Starfleet officer, of going out there to explore the galaxy. Assigned to Voyager just out of the Academy, Kim achieved that dream, although one version of him got to see a lot more of space than he had bargained for. Harry, the Miles O'Brien of the Delta Quadrant, ever suffering but without the promotion. "It's been a wild ride," Tom Paris said to Kim as the pair prepared to head off down to the Demon-class planet in Demon, where they would inadvertently create the misfortunes of the previous entry. It certainly had been a heck of one for Harry. "Hell, I've even come back from the dead," the ensign with newfound confidence had said. He was surely referring to Emanations, but comparatively speaking, he barely died in that. A couple of cc's of Cordrazine soon sorted it. Emanations was just the tip of the effed up iceberg of deaths for Voyager's freshest-faced newbie. In his reminiscing, Harry should really have spared a thought for his erstwhile other self, who had, and not for a lack of stretching, been blasted out of a hull breach in Deadlock. But ever the overachiever, Mr. Kim was not content with just one case of the coexistence of existence and non-existence. Harry got himself blown up towards the end of Timeless too, but not before resetting the timeline. And in theory, Captain Kim from the alternate future of Endgame also existed/never existed. But you'd have to check with the temporal mechanics department on that one. This is Starfleet, Ensign. Death is part of the job. And that concludes our list. Now, you might have noticed we've got a bit of a series going on here, so if you haven't already, go check out a similar list on messed up deaths in the original series and The Next Generation as well, and keep your eyes peeled for future episodes in this series too. In the meantime, I've been Ellie for TrekCulture. I hope you have a wonderful day, and remember to boldly go where no one has gone before.